They say a person vanishes in two ways. First, when their body disappears. Second, when their name is swallowed by time. But the story you're about to hear, the one buried beneath the pines of northern Washington, is different. Because this disappearance didn't fade, it didn't die, it grew teeth, it waited, and for more than 70 years it has stalked the people of Darrington like a shadow that refuses to move. On a winter morning in 1952, a schoolteacher named Ellen Crowder buttoned her coat, locked her classroom behind her, and walked into the woods toward a place locals called the Darrington cabin. She told her students she'd be back before sundown. She never was, and the cabin she walked toward, the one she thought held a terrified child who needed help, was the graveyard of something older, something no one in town had the courage to face. Most stories like this start with a rumor. This one starts with a scream, not Ellen's, but the sound that drew her into those trees. A high, broken wail drifting across the frozen valley, echoing through the hollows. People heard it for years before she arrived. They just learned to pretend they didn't. But Ellen wasn't from Darrington. She didn't know what the people here knew, that the cabin wasn't abandoned. It was avoided. That sometimes a closed door isn't meant to be opened for anyone's sake, especially your own. When Ellen stepped onto that narrow hunting trail, she carried nothing but a small lantern and a heart full of stubborn belief that no matter how dark a place becomes, someone must walk toward the crying. That's what she told her fellow teachers the week before. That ignoring suffering was worse than witnessing it. Those words would become the last thing anyone ever heard her say hours later. When she failed to return, a search party was sent out. They found her boot prints, but not where they expected. They didn't lead toward the well-worn path hikers used. They cut toward a part of the forest where the map simply ended, where the trees grew too close, too twisted, as if trying to guard something. The prints grew erratic, then circled, then vanished entirely, right at the threshold of that old cabin. Inside, they found no sign of Ellen Crowder. But they did find evidence that someone, or something, had been waiting for her, waiting a very long time. Most people in Darrington avoid talking about what the search party found beside that cabin, not because they're afraid of being called liars, but because they're afraid of being believed. You see, the cabin was older than the town itself, older than Washington's statehood. Locals said it was built by a family that arrived before anyone kept records, a family that lived so far from other settlers that even their language turned inward, curling into something only they understood. People whispered that the Darringtons weren't just reclusive. They were wrong in ways polite folks didn't describe out loud. When the rescuers pushed open the warped door, the first thing they noticed was the silence. Not the peaceful kind, the pressurized kind, as if the walls were holding their breath. Dust floated in the lantern light. The air smelled like cold soil and something metallic, and there on the far wall, carved into the old pine boards, were tally marks. Hundreds of them, some deep, some faint, some carved by shaky hands. The marks climbed all the way to the rafters, as if someone had been counting every day they spent trapped inside, or every day they survived something else. But that wasn't the detail that chilled the men the most. Near the center of the room lay a single object, Ellen's lantern, still warm, still glowing, as if she'd been standing there minutes before they arrived. Yet no footprints, no dropped belongings, no signs of a struggle. It was as though she had stepped out of existence in the span of a breath. One of the searchers, a logger named Roy Benson, refused to go any farther. He backed out of the cabin, muttering that the floorboards were wrong, that they weren't resting flat on earth like a normal structure, but floating slightly, shifting under his weight. No one believed him, not then. Later, when the floor was pried up, they would understand why Roy's voice kept shaking long after he returned home. The town sheriff ordered the group to sweep the surrounding woods. That's when they found something else. Just beyond the tree line, half buried in frost, lay a strip of fabric torn from Ellen's coat. It wasn't snagged on a branch, it wasn't dragged, it was neatly placed, as if set there for them to find. Some in the search party said nobody in those woods wanted Ellen Crowder to escape. Others said someone in those woods wanted her story to begin. Both might have been true. In the days that followed, the town tried to explain away Ellen's disappearance with the usual comforts: mountain lions, hypothermia, maybe a wrong turn in the snow. But none of those stories held up against the detail everyone silently avoided. Ellen Crowder wasn't the first person to vanish near that cabin. Not even close. Her name simply became the most painful one carved into a history nobody wanted to acknowledge. Long before Ellen arrived, the Darrington family had already earned a grim reputation. They were never photographed, never recorded in census logs, yet people swore they existed. They lived miles off the main road, moving only at night, the kind of family you crossed yourself after mentioning. The old-timers described them as pale, unnervingly silent, with eyes that struggled against sunlight like it was poison. No one remembered seeing them shop for supplies. No one remembered them working jobs. But every few years, a hunter or traveler would report seeing a flicker of lantern light in those woods and hearing a strange, wavering cry that sounded almost human. By the time Ellen went missing, the family had already been gone for decades, either dead, relocated, or simply vanished the way they always lived, quietly and without witnesses. Which raised the question that scratched at the sheriff's mind like a splinter he couldn't pull out. If the Darringtons were truly gone, then who lit the lantern inside that cabin? A week after the initial search, 2 deputies returned to re-examine the site. They didn't tell anyone they were going. They didn't want company. What they found made both men resign within the year. The tally marks on the walls had changed. The fresh tracks in the dust, smaller than boot prints, more like the prints of bare feet, weren't there during the first investigation. And lodged between 2 floorboards was something they nearly stepped over: a wooden button. The exact same style as the one sewn onto Ellen's coat. Not torn, not broken, unscrewed, removed with care. One deputy insisted it was evidence that Ellen had been alive after the search party left, that someone had kept her beneath those shifting floorboards. The other believed something worse, that Ellen hadn't walked into the cabin alone, that something had walked her in. When word spread through town, families locked their doors at dusk. Parents kept their children away from the woods, and the people who remembered the old Darringtons best began whispering something they hadn't said in decades. "They've taken another one." The sheriff knew the investigation was slipping away from him, not because of lack of evidence, but because every piece of evidence felt like it was pointing at something impossible. He called in a state inspector, a practical man named Harlan Briggs who cared more about paperwork than ghost stories. Briggs arrived with a clipboard, a stiff jaw, and absolute confidence that the townsfolk were letting superstition cloud their judgment. He walked into those woods certain he'd find an explanation rooted in human hands. By sunset, that confidence was shattered. Briggs spent hours inside the cabin, carefully noting every warped board, every odd draft, every whisper of cold air that rose from the gaps in the floor. He opened the cellar door, a low square cutout barely big enough for a child to crawl through, and peered into the darkness. His lantern illuminated nothing but packed dirt. No bones, no animals, no signs of Ellen. He sealed it back up, more annoyed than alarmed, jotting down that the entire case suffered from rural hysteria. But something changed when he stepped outside. The cabin door, which he had left wide open, was now shut, firmly, quietly, as if someone had been waiting for him to turn his back. Briggs called out, expecting the sheriff or a deputy to emerge from the trees. No answer, just the slow creaking of branches swaying in the cold. Then he saw it. A smear of color at the edge of the clearing, a small blue thread like the kind used in women's dresses. The same shade Ellen often wore to class, according to her students. He picked it up, turned it over in his hand, and realized something that made him drop it instantly. The thread was warm. Briggs returned to town before nightfall, but he wasn't the same. He told the sheriff, in a low, trembling voice, that the cabin was occupied. When pressed, he wouldn't say by what. Only that the floorboards were indeed shifting, not because something was under them, but because something had been moving around them. He resigned the next morning and left Darrington without collecting his final paycheck. But before he boarded the bus, he left the sheriff with one final note, folded twice and stained with the sweat of his shaking hands. It read, "Whatever took Ellen Crowder didn't take her by force. It took her by recognition, like she belonged to it." And if that was true, then the Darrington family's story was far from finished. As winter deepened, the case twisted into something the sheriff could no longer contain. People in town began waking to strange sounds drifting from the timberline, soft tapping, like knuckles on hollow wood. Some claimed they saw movement near the cabin, a slow shape weaving between the trees with a lantern that never dimmed. Others said they heard voices, not shouting, not screaming, whispering, as though someone was repeating the name Ellen over and over, practicing it the way a child practices a new word. Most of these reports were ignored. Fear distorts memory. Darkness turns imagination loose. But there was one account the sheriff couldn't dismiss, because it came from the man least likely to invent anything: Matthew Croft, the oldest living resident of the valley. Nearly 90, frail and half-blind, but with a memory sharper than broken glass. Croft asked the sheriff to sit close, lowered his voice, and said something no one else dared speak. The Darringtons were never just a family. They were a lineage, a bloodline that had survived by turning inward, cutting ties with the outside world, breeding only within their own circle until their features blurred, their minds bent, and their instincts twisted into something unrecognizable. He said the cabin wasn't a home, it was a cradle, a place where the last generation of the family was kept hidden, the generation that was never meant to see daylight. Croft remembered hearing stories as a child, stories whispered by settlers who stumbled upon the clearing and saw a figure pressed against the cabin window, pale, small, watching, waiting, a Darrington child, but not like any child they had ever known. Croft leaned forward and told the sheriff the part he had never shared. Years ago, long before Ellen arrived, he had heard crying from the woods too, the same broken wail that led her to her death. And he had done what she did, walked toward it. But as he approached the cabin, the crying stopped and something began knocking from inside the floor. Soft at first, then harder, faster, like fists pounding upward. Croft ran, and he never looked back. He told the sheriff that if Ellen heard that same knocking, she wouldn't have run. Teachers move toward fear when children are involved. It's instinct, it's weakness. And whatever lived under that cabin, it knew how to use that weakness. If you're still watching, you're already braver than most. Tell us in the comments. What would you have done if this was your bloodline? The sheriff didn't sleep after speaking with Matthew Croft. His mind kept circling the same question. If the Darrington bloodline had truly survived underground, inside that warped and rotting cabin, then what exactly was living down there? And why did it want Ellen? He returned to the site alone, against every instinct he had left. The woods felt different that night, quieter, heavy, as if something massive lay just beneath the roots, listening to every footstep. When he reached the clearing, the cabin seemed smaller than before, almost sagging in the middle as if its foundation had shifted. He took a breath, pushed open the door, and stepped inside. What he saw first made no sense. The tally marks on the walls, the ones that once stood alone, now had a second set beside them, a mirror set smaller, neater, and far more recent, as if someone new had begun counting the days. The sheriff ran his fingers over the fresh carvings, feeling the sharp edges. They couldn't have been more than a day old. He backed away, and that's when he heard it, a soft scrape beneath the floorboards. Slow, measured, like someone dragging their fingertips across the wood, testing the grain, learning its shape. He held his breath. The scraping stopped. For a moment he wondered if his mind was betraying him. But then came another sound, a tiny exhale, not a sigh, more like a curious sniff inches beneath his boots. The sheriff bolted outside, heart pounding. He didn't stop until he reached the edge of the clearing. And that's when he noticed something else, a track of small footprints leading from the back of the cabin into the tree line. Not the footprints of a child, too narrow, too long. The toes curled inwards, almost hoof-like, as though shaped by generations of bare feet walking only on dirt floors. There were 4 sets of them, all leading outward, which meant something that had once been trapped inside wasn't trapped anymore. The sheriff followed the prints until they vanished into a swampy patch where the ground turned soft, but one detail froze him in place. On a branch above the mud hung a single object, Ellen Crowder's scarf, folded clean, dry, placed gently, almost lovingly over the limb, as if to say, "We still have her, and we know you're looking." That night, the sheriff wrote his resignation letter, not because he was afraid of what he had seen, but because he was terrified of what he hadn't yet seen. He believed the Darrington children had come out of the ground. He believed they had taken Ellen, and worst of all, he believed they weren't done. In the spring thaw of 1953, nearly 5 months after Ellen Crowder vanished, a hiker stumbled into the sheriff's office with a look that didn't match any injury, a look of someone who had seen something their mind refused to accept. He said he found a clearing deep in the North Ridge, a part of the forest nobody mapped, where the ground looked freshly overturned, as though something had burrowed upward from below. The sheriff didn't want to go. His resignation letter was still sitting on his desk, but something in the hiker's trembling voice told him the truth was no longer waiting for permission. They trekked into the forest together, following the rough directions given, north of the river bend, past the snare-lined trees, through an area where the underbrush grew strangely thin. The clearing revealed itself slowly, one tree at a time, and then the smell hit them, damp soil, cold air, and something faintly sweet, like rotted fruit. The sheriff raised his lantern and saw the disturbed earth, circular patterns, smooth, almost hand-shaped, as though something had clawed its way to the surface slowly, patiently. And in the center of the clearing was a mound, small, deliberate, fresh. The sheriff approached it with the caution of a man expecting the ground to breathe. Kneeling, he brushed away the loose dirt. At first nothing appeared but pale roots and stone. Then he uncovered something that made his spine seize. A button, wooden, hand-carved, identical to the ones on Ellen's coat. But this one was cracked, broken clean down the center, torn, not unscrewed. A button removed by force, not care. Behind him, the hiker suddenly whispered that he felt watched. The sheriff stood, lantern trembling, and scanned the tree line. The forest was silent, no birds, no wind, just the heavy, waiting quiet of something holding its breath. Then he saw them, 4 shapes, low to the ground, crouched at the edge of the clearing. Pale skin that reflected the lantern light like bone. Limbs too narrow, too long. Heads tilted, studying him with the eerie stillness of creatures that had never learned human movement. Their eyes, if they had eyes, were lost in shadow. One of them stepped forward on those narrow, curling feet. In its hand, dangling by torn threads, was the rest of Ellen Crowder's coat. The sheriff didn't reach for his weapon. He didn't shout. He didn't run. Because he finally understood what Harlan Briggs had meant. The Darrington creatures hadn't taken Ellen as prey. They had taken her as kin, not stolen, chosen. The sheriff stepped back slowly, lantern shaking. The shapes slipped into the trees without sound, carrying the coat with them, vanishing in seconds like they had never existed in the first place. Ellen's body was never found. But every spring, when the ground softens and the forest exhales, hikers report seeing small, pale figures moving between the trees, carrying something faded and blue. A piece of fabric, a scarf, a sleeve, and always a lantern glowing in the dark. Some say it's her spirit, others say it's them. But the locals, the ones who still remember the old stories, whisper something far worse. Ellen didn't disappear. She joined the family, and the Darrington bloodline lives on.